On a bright June morning in 1884, the largest cattle outfit in the Wyoming Territory opened the doors of a brand new cookhouse. Oak beams, a cast-iron stove freighted all the way from St. Louis, and a name burned deep into the lintel above the door. It was not the name of the rancher who paid for it. It was the name of a woman that 7 ranches in that county had refused to hire, a widow the bank had tried to starve off her own land, a cook whose bread half the town had eaten while pretending not to know her. The ranchers who had turned her away stood in line that morning with their hats in their hands, waiting for a seat at her tables, and the biggest man any of them had ever seen stood beside the door, saying nothing at all, watching her serve every single one of them. Nobody in Cedar Bluff believed a story like that could happen. This is how it did. If you have ever been told, politely, that there was no place for you, if you have ever watched doors close one after another and wondered whether the problem was the doors or you, then this story was written for you. Take a second to subscribe to Wild Hope Tales, because we tell the stories of the overlooked people who turned out to be worth more than the whole room. Drop the name of your city in the comments so we know how far this story has traveled tonight. And stay until the very end, because the last thing Hattie Prescott does in this story is the thing the whole town would remember longest. Now let's go back to Cedar Bluff, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1883, to where it all began. Cedar Bluff sat in a shallow bend of the Milk Creek Valley, a town of 1 church, 1 bank, 1 mercantile, and 1,100 head of gossip that moved faster than any herd. The cattle outfits spread out from it in every direction like spokes from a wheel, and the man who sat at the hub of that wheel was Cornelius Vance, president of the Cedar Bluff Bank and president of the Stock Growers Association, a man who wore gray wool in the summer and smiled at everyone and was owed money by nearly all of them. Hattie Prescott lived 4 miles east of town on 160 acres her husband had proved up with his own hands, a homestead with a garden, a milk cow, a smokehouse, and the headwaters of a spring-fed creek that never froze solid, not even in the winter of '81. Tom Prescott had been a good man and a middling farmer, and in the spring of 1883 he had drowned trying to pull a neighbor's steer out of the flooded crossing at Miller's Ford. He left Hattie the land, the cow, a note at the bank for $300, and a silence in the house so large she had to work from dark to dark just to keep from hearing it. She was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders and broad through the hips, with forearms that could lift a full washtub off the fire without asking for help, and hands that had kneaded so much bread over so many years that the dough seemed to rise faster just from knowing whose hands it was in. She was the kind of woman that men noticed when there was hauling to be done and forgot when the music started. She had been fed on work her whole life, and it showed in her body the way weather shows in a barn, not as damage, but as proof of standing. After Tom died, she did the arithmetic at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil. The garden and the cow would feed her. They would not pay $300 plus interest to Cornelius Vance by the 1st of March, but Hattie could cook. She could cook the way some men could rope, without thinking, without missing, better under pressure. She had fed threshing crews of 20 men out of 1 stove. She had fed a funeral, a wedding, and a cattle drive in the same week, and been complimented on all 3. Every big outfit in the county fed a crew, and every big outfit in the county complained about its cook. So on a Monday in September she put on her good dress, hitched the wagon, and drove out to ask for work. The Tillman place turned her down on Tuesday. Roy Tillman stood in his own doorway, looked at his boots, and said the men were used to old Charlie's cooking, and change unsettled a crew. The McAllister outfit turned her down on Wednesday, and the foreman would not look at her at all. By the end of that week, she had been refused by 4 ranches, and by the end of the next week, by 7. 7 ranches that fed between them over 100 men. 7 ranches whose hands ate burned beans and gray coffee and complained about it in the Mercantile every Saturday, and not one of them could find a place for the best cook in the county. The last one, the Langley spread, at least gave her a reason. Old Mrs. Langley took her hand at the door, pressed it, and said, "It isn't the cooking, dear. You know it isn't the cooking." Then she looked over Hattie's shoulder toward the road to town, toward the bank, and said nothing else at all. Hattie drove home with her back straight, the whole 4 miles. In the kitchen she took off her good dress, folded it along its creases, and set it in the trunk. Then she stood at the counter and scrubbed a clean pot until her knuckles ached, because a woman had to do something with her hands while she decided not to be finished. There was one outfit she had not asked. The Drummond Ranch lay 12 miles north, the biggest spread in the county and the only one that owed Cornelius Vance nothing, but 12 miles was a long way to drive to collect an 8th refusal, and Hattie Prescott had used up her appetite for closed doors. She had never met Amos Drummond. She knew him the way everyone knew him, by sight, from a distance, the way you know a mountain. He stood closer to 7 feet than 6, wide as a barn door through the shoulders, a man who had once lifted a loaded freight wagon off a trapped boy's leg while 4 other men were still looking for a pole to lever it with. The town called him the Giant Cowboy when he could not hear them, and Mr. Drummond when he could. He came to Cedar Bluff twice a month, bought what he needed, spoke perhaps a dozen words, and rode home. Some said he was proud, some said he was simple. The truth, which almost nobody in that county had troubled to learn, was that he was quiet the way deep water is quiet, and that he missed very little. Since the ranches would not let her cook for wages, Hattie decided the road itself would be her employer. Her homestead sat where the east trail bent toward the railhead, and every week riders, freighters, and drovers passed her gate hungry. She built a plank table under the cottonwood by the fence, and on it she set what her stove could make: brown bread, dried apple pies, cold fried chicken, crocks of beans that had simmered all night with salt pork and molasses. She painted no sign. She needed none. The first freighter who bought a loaf of her bread told the second, and the second told the railhead, and by the middle of October men were timing their trips past the Prescott place the way they timed river crossings, carefully and with intent. It was a Thursday at the end of October when Amos Drummond first stopped at her gate. She heard the horse before she saw it, a big-boned buckskin that had to be 17 hands to carry him, and when he swung down out of the saddle, the yard seemed to get smaller. He stood at the plank table with his hat in one hand and looked at the bread the way other men looked at horses they were thinking of buying. "2 loaves," he said. "If you can spare them." "I can spare them." She wrapped them in brown paper and tied the string in a bow because her hands did that without permission. 10 cents the pair. He laid down a quarter, and when she reached for change, he had already turned to the pies. "What's in the crust?" he said. It was not quite a question, but she answered it anyway. "Lard and butter both. Lard for the flake, butter for the flavor. Most cooks pick a side. Most cooks are wrong." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, too brief to be called a smile, more like the shadow of a bird crossing a field. "Our cook picks neither," he said. "Pete boils everything. I believe he'd boil a pie if the men would stand for it." "How many do you feed?" 26, this time of year. 40 at roundup." "Then your Pete is a brave man," Hattie said. "Boiling for 26. It takes courage to do a thing that badly in front of that many witnesses." Amos Drummond looked at her then, straight on, the first time he had done it, and she saw that his eyes were the gray of a kettle left out in the weather, and that they were not simple at all. He put the 2 loaves in his saddlebag with a care that struck her as out of proportion to bread, and he said, "Thursday next I'll want 2 more. They'll be here." He was in the saddle, and halfway turned before he spoke again. "The apple pie," he said. "Is it the drying does that, or the cinnamon?" It's the pinch of salt nobody believes I put in." He nodded once, slowly, the way men nod at the answer to a question they have been carrying a long time, and rode north. He came back the next Thursday, and the one after, and every Thursday from then on, through November and into the hard weather. Always 2 loaves, never more, though 26 men could eat 2 loaves of bread the way a stove eats kindling. Always a quarter, never taking change. And always one question, asked at the end with his hand already on the saddle horn, as if it had only just occurred to him, how she kept her sourdough starter alive in a cold kitchen, whether beans wanted soaking in soft water or hard, why her coffee didn't bite the back of a man's throat the way every camp coffee he'd ever drunk did. She answered every question honestly and completely, the way one tradesman answers another, because it had been a long time since anyone had asked her about her work, as though the answer were worth riding 12 miles to hear. "You could just ask for the whole pie at once," she told him on the 3rd Thursday, wrapping his loaves. "The receipt, I mean, instead of one question a week." "I could," Amos said. He settled the bread into the saddlebag with that same careful hand. "But then I'd have the whole pie." She turned that sentence over for 2 days before she let herself understand it, and when she did, she was rolling crust at the time, and she stood very still with flour to her wrists, and looked out the window at the empty north road for a long moment. Then she went back to the crust, because it would not roll itself, and because hope, in her experience, was like yeast. You did not stare at it. You fed it a little, kept it somewhere warm, and went about your work. By December, the Thursdays had a shape of their own. He began to arrive earlier, when the bread was still warm enough to fog the paper. She began, without ever deciding to save back the 2 best loaves of the batch. He mended the sagging hinge of her gate one week, without being asked, and without mentioning it after. She knew it only by the silence where the squeak had been. And once, when a hard freeze had come early, and her woodpile had shrunk to a nervous height, she came out one Friday morning to find a half-cord of split pine stacked against the smokehouse wall, laid in so neatly it might have grown there. He never spoke of it. She never thanked him. Some things between them were said in bread and firewood, and both of them seemed to find that language sufficient. Cornelius Vance heard about the plank table under the cottonwood the way he heard about everything in that county, early and in detail. It did not please him, though no one watching him would have known it, because Cornelius Vance had spent 30 years perfecting the art of being displeased while smiling. The truth of the 7 refusals was very simple, and it lived in a drawer of his desk at the bank. The Prescott note was for $300, due the 1st of March, and the collateral was the homestead, 160 acres that would not have interested Vance at all, except that the spring-fed creek rising on that land ran down through the valley and watered 4 of the ranches that owed him money. The man who owned that water owned a hand on the throat of half the county. Vance had offered Tom Prescott twice, politely, to buy the place. Tom had declined, politely. Then Tom had drowned, and Vance had waited a decent interval of nearly 3 weeks before beginning to arrange matters. The arrangement required only that the widow have no income. So when Roy Tillman had come into the bank in September to extend his own note, Vance had signed the extension, blotted it, and remarked, without looking up, that it would be a pity if any of the association's outfits took on kitchen help whose circumstances were, as he put it, unsettled. A woman with a debt was a distraction, and distractions were bad for credit. He said a version of this 7 times, to 7 men, and never once told anyone what to do. That was Vance's particular gift. He never gave orders. He only described the weather, and let other men decide to come in out of the rain. The plank table was a leak in his arrangement. The reports that reached him got worse through the fall. The widow was selling 40 loaves a week, then 60. Freighters were carrying her pies to the railhead and selling them at double. She had, by the mercantile's account, paid her November interest in full and in cash. and Amos Drummond's buckskin had been seen at her gate on enough Thursdays that even the men who did not gossip had begun to keep count. Vance chose the church social in mid-December to address the matter, because he did his best work in rooms full of witnesses. Hattie was there, she still came to church, and let the town make of it what it wanted, standing near the cake table she had supplied half of, when Vance drifted over with two of the association wives in tow, holding a slice of her dried apple pie on a china plate like an exhibit. "Mrs. Prescott," he said warmly, "this pie is a wonder. I've said so all evening." He turned just enough to include the wives, and the room behind them. Bless her heart. Out there all alone, baking for teamsters at a fence rail. She'd feed the whole county if it would keep a roof over her, and I admire it, truly. But charity is not employment, is it? And a fence rail is not a future. Some situations simply can't be baked away. He set the plate down gently, patted the table twice as though it were a horse, and moved off smiling to shake the minister's hand. The wives murmured. The room went back to its noise, and Hattie stood with her hands folded in front of her apron, pressing her thumbnail into the pad of her finger, hard, slowly, until the wave passed through her and was gone. Then she cut the next slice of pie for the Bowman girl, and her hand did not shake doing it, and if you had not been watching her thumbnail, you would have sworn the words had never landed at all. Amos Drummond had not been at the social, but Roy Tillman had, standing near the stove with his coffee, and Roy Tillman had been carrying a low, private misery in his gut since September, the way a man carries a stone in his boot. He watched Vance drift away smiling. He looked at the widow cutting pie for children with steady hands, and he took his coffee out to the porch in the cold, where a man could stand by himself and think poorly of himself in peace. January came down on the valley like a lid on a pot. The east trail thinned to a trickle of half-frozen riders, and the plank table came indoors. Men knocked at the kitchen door now, stamping snow, and Hattie sold what she could to whoever came. It was enough to eat on. It was not enough to finish the note, and she knew it, and she did the arithmetic again by lamplight most nights, moving the same small numbers around the page like furniture in a room too small for them. On the 9th of January, Cornelius Vance drove out to the homestead himself in his covered buggy, which was an honor he generally reserved for funerals and foreclosures. Hattie gave him coffee at her kitchen table because her mother had raised her to give coffee even to the weather. He warmed his hands on the cup, praised the coffee, praised the tidiness of the room, and then unfolded his offer on the table between them, as neatly as a napkin. The bank, he said, was prepared to forgive the note entirely, all $300, and the interest with it. In exchange, she would sign over the deed, and the bank would additionally pay her $100 cash, which was, he observed, more than generous for a place so far from town. There was a westbound train on the 1st of February. A woman of her abilities would do wonderfully in Cheyenne, or Denver, or really anywhere at all. Anywhere, his tone said, but here. "And if I stay and pay the note?" Hattie asked. Vance smiled at his coffee. "The note comes due March 1st, Mrs. Prescott. If it is paid, and no one will be happier than I. But we both know what $160 still owing looks like against a fence rail bakery in January." He rose, buttoned his coat, and paused at the door with his hat in his hand. "Take the kindness, Mrs. Prescott," he said gently. "It is not always offered twice." She stood at the window and watched his buggy shrink up the town road, and then she took out the paper he had left and read it through twice. $100 and a clean slate, a train west, a rented room, a fresh town where nobody knew her, where a cook could be just a cook and a widow just a widow. It was, by any honest arithmetic, the sensible thing, and Hattie Prescott had been sensible her entire life. She thought about Tom, who had drowned pulling out another man's steer because helping was the only language he was fluent in. She thought about the creek, which she had watched Vance's eyes go to, twice, through the kitchen window while his mouth was saying other things, and she understood then, all at once and completely, the way you understand a receipt you've read a dozen times the moment you finally cook it. This had never been about her debt. It was about her water. The 7 doors had not closed on their own. Somebody had gone down the row ahead of her, quietly, and locked them. She fed Vance's paper to the stove and watched it curl. What was left was work, so she worked. She took on the one job in the county nobody had thought to deny her, the Stock Growers Association's winter supper, held every February in the church hall, the biggest table of the year, and the ladies' committee had always hired it out for a pittance because feeding 140 people was drudgery no one wanted. Hattie wanted it. Let the 7 ranches that would not pay her wages sit down all in one room and eat her cooking with their own mouths in front of each other. She named the committee a price that was too low and worth it, and spent 3 weeks planning that supper the way generals plan campaigns. And then, 11 days before the supper, the storm came. A 2-day screamer out of the northwest that dropped the world to 20 below and erased the roads. On the second night of it, fists hammered her door. 3 of the Tillman outfit's hands, half frozen, driven off the range when the weather caught them moving cattle to shelter, their horses done in, the ranch house an impossible 8 miles off. Hattie hauled them inside, and for 2 days she fed 3 large snowbound men out of her winter stores, the beans, the salt pork, the flour she had been hoarding against February, the coffee she had rationed for herself by the half-spoon. She never once weighed the arithmetic of it out loud, though she knew exactly, to the pound and the penny, what those 2 days cost her. When the sky broke and the men dug out their horses, the youngest of them, a boy of maybe 19, stood in her doorway turning his hat in his hands and said, "Ma'am, they told us in the bunkhouse not to, that is, we heard we oughtn't," and could not finish it. "I know what you heard," Hattie said, and filled his coat pockets with biscuits, and sent him home. Roy Tillman rode over himself 2 days later with a side of bacon and a sack of flour to replace what his men had eaten, and sat in her kitchen for a quarter hour, saying very little. At the door, he stopped. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, "there's things in this county that ain't right, and some of them are things I done." He got as far as his horse before his nerve finished failing him, and rode off with the rest of it unsaid. But a stone in a man's boot only works deeper the longer he walks on it, and Roy Tillman still had a distance to go. The night of the winter supper, the church hall glowed like a lantern in the dark, and every family that mattered in the county, and most that didn't, sat down at trestle tables under bunting to eat Hattie Prescott's cooking. She had been in that borrowed kitchen since 4 in the morning. Roast beef and gravy dark as river bottom, beans that had cooked so long they had opinions, 4 kinds of pie, bread enough to shingle a roof, coffee that 140 people drank without one bitter face. She served it herself with 2 hired girls moving between the tables in her apron, and she watched the 7 men who had turned her away eat second helpings and thirds, and she wished them, with a wide and terrible politeness, good appetite. Amos Drummond sat at the far end of the second table, and he did not eat much, which for a man his size was a thing people noticed. He watched the room. He had been watching rooms his whole life. It was what quiet men did instead of talking. He watched Cornelius Vance work the head table like a hand working a rope, and he watched the door, and he waited, because for once in his careful life, Amos Drummond knew something the room did not, and the knowing sat in him bright and steady as a banked fire. When the pie was down to crumbs, Vance rose, chimed his glass with a spoon, and delivered 15 minutes of the association's business: beef prices, the spring roundup, a resolution of thanks to the ladies' committee. And then, with the room warm and fed and full of witnesses, he arrived at the paragraph he had built the whole evening to carry. It was his sad duty, he said, arranging his face into the shape of sympathy, to inform the association that the bank would be posting a foreclosure notice on the Prescott homestead, the note there having no prospect of satisfaction by the 1st of March. The auction would be held on the courthouse steps the second Saturday of that month. He hoped, and here he found Hattie with his eyes, where she stood at the serving table with a coffee pot in her hand. He sincerely hoped that Mrs. Prescott, whose supper they had all enjoyed so thoroughly tonight, would allow the good people of this county to help her toward a situation better suited to her circumstances. He was beginning the sentence after that one when Hattie set down the coffee pot. The sound of it, tin on plank, was not loud, but the room heard it, and the room turned, and Hattie Prescott stood up straight in her apron, with her floury hands folded in front of her, and spoke in the voice she used for calling across a farmyard, which reached every corner of that hall without effort. 7 ranches in this room told me last September there was no work for a cook, she said. Tonight, I count 140 of you eating my supper, and not a plate going back to my kitchen with anything on it but the pattern. So it was never my cooking that was unsettled, Mr. Vance. It was my circumstances, and you have been the circumstances all along. You may auction my land off the courthouse steps if the law lets you, but you will not stand in a hall I fed and call it a kindness. I have fed this county at its weddings and its funerals and its winter suppers, and I will not beg it for what I have already earned. The hall went so quiet that the stove could be heard settling. Vance's smile held, but it held the way ice holds in late March. And it was into that silence that Roy Tillman lurched up from his bench, gray in the face, gripping the table edge, and said, louder than he meant to, "She's owed better, and I'll say why." And he told them, September, the bank office, the extension, and the weather report about unsettled circumstances that 7 ranchers had all somehow heard in the same month, in the same words, in the same office. 2 other men did not stand, but did not look at Vance either, and their not looking was as loud as testimony. Vance began smoothly about hearsay and about hard feelings, and that was when the bench at the second table scraped back, and Amos Drummond stood up, and the hall discovered how low its ceiling was. He did not raise his voice. He never had needed to. "Cornelius," he said, "the Prescott note isn't yours to auction. I wired the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne 3 weeks back and bought the paper at face. It's settled, and it's canceled, and the deed stays where it belongs." He let that sit a moment, then turned so that he was facing Hattie down the length of the hall, and he took his hat off, which he had not done for Vance. "Mrs. Prescott, I've eaten your bread every Thursday since October, and I've watched you feed this county with both hands while it sat on its own. I had my men building all winter, and I'd meant to ask you private, but I find I don't care to ask you private. There's a cookhouse standing new on my ranch. Good stove, good light, a door wide enough to be welcoming. I built it for you. Head cook of the Drummond outfit, wages named by you, and your own land yours behind you, free and clear. Not charity. I don't buy bread as charity, and I don't build kitchens for pity. I built it because you're the steadiest, most honest, most capable soul in this county, and any outfit that couldn't see that doesn't deserve to eat." Nobody in that hall breathed. Hattie Prescott looked down the length of it at the biggest man in the territory standing bareheaded with a burned-down county's worth of quiet in his face, and she picked the coffee pot back up off the table because her hands wanted something to hold on to, and she said, "Does the new stove draw?" "Like a preacher's plate," said Amos. "Then I'll come Monday and see it," she said, "and if it's half what you say, you'll have your cook." The hall came apart then, laughter and stamping and the ladies' committee weeping into the bunting, and somewhere in the middle of it Cornelius Vance gathered his coat and his hat and found the cold air outside, and it is worth recording that not one person followed him out. and that within the year the association had a new president, and the bank a good deal less to say about the weather. She came on Monday, as promised, driving her own wagon the 12 miles north through a thaw that had the meadowlarks confused into singing. The cookhouse stood off the east end of the bunkhouse, new lumber still bright as biscuit, and when Amos opened the door for her, she stood on the threshold a long moment before she went in. The stove was a 6-lid iron beauty with a warming shelf and an oven a woman could trust. The work table was built at a height that told her someone had asked somewhere how tall she was. There were windows on 2 walls, real glass, set where the morning light would fall across the kneading board, and a pantry with shelves already planed smooth, waiting to be filled with the particular order of a particular cook. Hattie walked the room twice, with her hands clasped behind her back like an inspector, opened the oven, checked the damper, ran her palm along the table's edge, and found not one splinter. Then she stood in the middle of her kitchen, for it was hers, and had been hers since before she saw it, and they both knew it, and looked at the man filling the doorway. "The starter will need a week to settle in a new room," she said. "First bread worth eating comes next Thursday." "I can wait for Thursday," Amos said. "I've had the practice." She cooked her first supper for the Drummond outfit that same week, and 26 men found reasons to wash before eating for the first time in recorded memory. Through that spring she drove up on Mondays and home on Saturdays, and the Thursday loaves changed direction. Now it was Hattie who set aside 2, and Amos who came to the cookhouse door at dusk to collect them, and neither of them ever suggested the arrangement was in any way unusual. He proposed in May, in the cookhouse, in the morning, with flour still hanging in the light between them. He had brought no ring out where she could see it, and made no speech to start. He stood at the end of her work table while she shaped loaves, and after a while he said, "Hattie, I've thought a long time about how to say it, and I've decided plain is best. You never once asked this county's permission to be worth something, and watching you not ask it is the finest thing I've seen in 40 years of watching. Marry me. Not the cook. I'll keep the cook regardless, and pay her better than I pay my foreman. Marry me because there's nobody in the territory I'd rather be quiet with." Hattie finished the loaf she was shaping. She set it in the pan, seam down, the way a thing is done right or not at all, and dusted her hands, and looked up at him with her eyes bright and her voice perfectly level. "You'll eat supper with the men, same as always," she said. "I'll not cook 2 suppers. Wouldn't ask it. And the Thursday bread stays ours." "That," said Amos, "was the whole idea from the start." "Then, yes," said Hattie Prescott, and the Giant Cowboy laughed out loud for the first time anyone on that ranch could remember, a sound like a barn door swinging in a warm wind, and lifted her clean off the floor as easily as she lifted a proving bowl, and kissed her in the flower-hung light of the kitchen he had built her. They married in June, in the churchyard at Cedar Bluff, because Hattie said a wedding wanted open sky. It was a plain wedding, and a crowded one. The Tillman hands came scrubbed, and the boy she had fed through the storm stood in the front row, holding his hat over his heart. Mrs. Langley wept. The ladies' committee did the cooking, terrified, and Hattie ate every dish and praised each one by name, and meant it, because she knew better than anyone alive what it cost to feed people while they watched. Amos wore a collar that fit him like a fence wears wire, and said his vows in 9 words, and made every one of them hold weight. And when they drove north that evening in the wagon, the whole town stood in the road to see them off. The same town, the same road, the same woman it had once left standing at 7 closed doors. 2 years on, in the spring of 1886, the Drummond cookhouse fed 40 hands at roundup, and half the travelers on the North Road besides, and above its wide oak door, burned deep into the lintel by Amos's own hand, were 2 words, Hattie's Kitchen. New hands learned the story of that lintel their first week, told low over coffee, and the ranchers who came to buy Drummond cattle always seemed to time their business around dinner. It was that April that a young widow named Etta Bowman walked the last 2 miles to the ranch on foot, 23 years old, thin at the wrists, with a reference letter gone soft from handling, and 3 refusals already behind her in town. A girl with a debt, people said, and unsettled circumstances. Hattie read the letter at her work table, then set it down and looked at the girl's hands instead, which were cracked at the knuckles, the way hands crack from washing other people's floors. "Can you keep a starter alive in a cold kitchen?" Hattie asked. "I can learn it, ma'am." "Then you're hired, and you'll learn it by Thursday." She tied an apron on the girl herself, turning her by the shoulders toward the stove. "One thing first, and hear it plain. Nobody in this county was ever going to make room for you. That's not a cruelty, child. It's just the weather. So you make the room yourself, and you build it warm, and you build the door wide." She handed Etta the bread knife, handle first, because no door ever gets to tell you what you're worth. It only ever tells you where they're afraid to let you stand.